In this video, we're going to go over how to use light and shadow to provide form in your own drawings. If you're interested, keep watching. Hey, my name is Alex. You might also know me as Radio Runner on Instagram. Welcome to my channel where I help you guys become more effective artists. Today I'm going to go over some demos that I made rendering light and shadow. It's going to cover basic primitives and how that extends into things like drawing on heads and with figures. There's not much more that needs to be said at this point, so we're just going to hop right in. I start off the demo drawing some primitive forms from imagination. They're basically breakdowns of a cylinder and a sphere, but I turn them into planar forms. I essentially boil them down to low polygon versions of themselves so that they lose the curves and you can see what's happening with light. If we add some value to this first cylinder and I have the light direction coming over from the left, I can show you that on the plane you've got the highlight that reflects right off of the front. And since the light isn't reflecting perfectly on the next plane, it reflects off of it, it's going to receive less light and turn into a halftone. However, since it's still in light, it's going to maintain that light value. It's only until the cylinder hits the sideways point and light is no longer reflecting or hitting the cylinder at all does it turn into shadow. You can see that I set up a wall to the right of this cylinder, and the light that hits that wall then reflects onto the back side. So this creates reflected light or bounce light. With that reflected light, the core shadow then appears darker than the rest of it. I made these other primitives just to show you a couple of more examples. So here's a planar cylinder, and I've got the light coming directly from the top this time. It's basically the same scenario. This time I try to shade with just hatching rather than paint. And the same thing happens here. It's a bit of a gradual process as I build up the values. You can see the top edge is purely white because it's directly reflecting the light source from above. The next edge is a little less strong because it's not direct sunlight and therefore the light is reflecting off of it in different ways. As soon as that vertical line of the sunlight no longer reflects off of that side plane, it falls to shadow. Instead of being entirely shadow though, it still has reflected light, so the bottom plane of the cylinder that we can see wrapping around is a little bit lighter. And lastly, I'll show you a planar sphere where I have the light source coming from above and a little from behind the camera. If you can imagine that the top planes are hitting the light and reflecting back to our eyeballs, they're going to stay in a light value. Halftone values are essentially just light but with minute differences. You never want to get them so close to the shadow side that you can't really tell which is which. So if I color pick and I go to each plane where I point an arrow, you can see the differences in value. The top planes where light is bouncing off directly are pure white, and then I have slight variations that turn to a mid-gray. And then in shadow, it's significantly darker. The cool thing about breaking primitives down into planar forms like this is that you start to understand exactly what is happening with light reflection. And if you want to start blending things out, just take a blend brush, make things a little bit rounder, smooth things out, and you're off to the races. So here is an image from Geo Art References. It's a Patreon group made by a buddy of mine named Jeff Talbot, and he models a bunch of shapes in 3D so that we can have perfect accurate lighting for still lifes. If you want to learn more, you can go to Geo Art Ref on Gumroad, and there's at least a free pack on there, I know. We can use this example to see a little bit of how light casts shadow. Now this image isn't going to totally replicate the one on the left, I'm going to simplify it a little bit more. When you have the light coming from that upper right angle to the square, you're going to take that light down where it connects from the corner all the way down to where it would reach the vanishing point line that continues from the box. When you find that for each corner that is going to be blocked and then connect the dots on the ground plane, you get a cast shadow. We can try that again here with a similar scenario on the left image, but from a different angle. I light from the top left and connect all the dots on the ground. You also have to do this from behind so that you're drawing through your boxes, but when you do this, your cast shadows become very accurate and believable. In the future, I can do an entire video on this if you want. Just let me know in the comments. And GeoArtRef has a ton of images that are really useful for us to look at so that we can understand exactly how primitives behave under a single light source. Notice that with the sphere, the light is coming from behind it. It casts a shadow on the exact angle which we can find by connecting the point from the shadow to the edge of the sphere. And notice that it's not entirely dark on the bottom. It's got that ground plane reflecting a lot of light to the bottom of that sphere. The same holds true for cylinders, cones, pyramids. This is really useful stuff to know because it applies to everything you do in art later on. By understanding light direction, where it goes, and how it creates a core shadow, you're already halfway there. A little bit of terminology on this sphere. The brightest part is called the highlight. You then have full light on that object until it rounds off and reaches the terminator line, which is where I showed you guys on those planar forms. The light no longer reflects and hits the surface at all, so it terminates and no longer receives light. You give that nice bounce light on the bottom, and then if you notice and look really closely, you have what is called ambient occlusion. This is essentially describing where light can no longer reach because it doesn't reflect easily. It's really low angle, or the crevice is too tight for the light to reach, and it fades down to black. This is probably the biggest thing to keep in mind for grounding the believability of your objects. Ambient occlusion can be forgotten by a lot of beginners, but it is a key factor. So I'll put a render here together. You guys can try to paint along with this or pick a reference of your own. My process is that I establish a value that I see in the background, and then I build up additively. So I set my darkest values on all of the shapes. I then go and establish where the light is hitting and use a single light value for all of that area. I establish the cast shadows, and then you can go in and fill the shadow side with reflected light. This does a ton for the three-dimensionality of the objects that you render. When you're happy with your reflected light, all you have to do is finish off with ambient occlusion, and when it's grounded in space. There are tons of different ways that you can do this. It's not just digital. You can use pencil just fine. I know that Proco and Dorian Eaton have a fantastic video going over dirty lights and how to render with pencil. But knowing this, you can apply the knowledge of using simple forms with light into complex things like a head. Now, a head is essentially a sphere and a box mashed together, and you get that if you know the Loomis head. But if you really want to level up your heads, you'll want to look up the Asaro. On the left is a simplified version, and on the right is the full planar version of the Asaro. Understanding light will then allow you to use the planar knowledge to get accurate lighting for faces. I would normally paint value in, but I thought it'd be fun to try lines and show you how you can build that up in case you guys are using pencil and not digital. For myself, it's a gradual process where I build up value and understand the value relationship as I go on. There are things you can think about like the halfway to black rule, but for myself, I really just like to know that I separate my lights and darks values from each other so that there's a clear separation. As long as you keep those separated clearly, you'll be able to read the image and it's going to come off believably. So moving on a bit, I show you guys here how you can apply your knowledge of light and shadow to complex forms like figures as long as you break them down into primitives first. Figures are made out of boxes, cylinders, and sometimes spheres, like for the head. So I'll draw a figure out from imagination here, just building it up from primitive construction. If we establish our light source from the upper right, we can then use that knowledge to say, well, the bottom left sides are not going to be receiving light, I'll fill them in with dark tone. But you'll remember from the earlier examples that most objects are still receiving reflected light from their environment. So if you go in and strengthen where you added value with that core shadow, and either smooth it out or just paint it in or draw it in smoothly, it's going to look extra good. So I strengthen those core shadows and you really get a feel that the form is rounding around. For the rest of this, I'll take you guys through some general demos with figure drawing and applying the light that we see from reference. I'm not going with very advanced anatomy here, I'm still keeping it very simple so that we understand how the light direction affects it. But I'm also looking for the light shapes from the reference. This is a term that I've heard called shadow mapping, where you add the terminator line first to all of your forms and design those shapes clearly and well. Then you go fill it in all with a single shadow color and you're golden. You'll already receive that three-dimensional look. We can try this again. I'll start with a gesture and we'll let his anatomy get slightly more complex this time instead of just purely cylinders. Looking at the light shapes, I start to design them out. I'm looking specifically for where the light turns to shadow and nothing more. Once I do that, I fill in the entire rest of the body with a single shadow value, which I hatch in, and you can see how the light rounds out into shadow. It looks pretty good. And finally here, I'll do the same thing on a slightly more detailed drawing. I start off with a base figure, get my proportions in check, and then I add in my detailed core shadow designs. Once I'm happy with how they look, I go in and fill in the shadow. Some other tricks that I'm doing here is adding line weight to the sides that are in shadow. It adds a little bit of solidity to the image. I finish it off with some cast shadows and adjust the proportions, and I consider that drawing finished for a study. And that's everything that I have to show you guys this week. If you found using simple forms like cylinders a little bit difficult, you might want to check out my video on cross contouring so that you can understand cylinders a little better. Leave a like and subscribe below if you enjoyed this, guys. Every little bit goes a long way. If you have a question over this video or anything else, really, consider leaving a question down in the comment section below or hopping into my Discord channel, link in the description, where myself and others are talking about how to learn art more effectively every single day. In that Discord, we talk about the curriculum that I made. It goes over all of the resources we have on the internet and YouTube and condenses them down into essentially your own personal art school. If you follow it, I promise you will get better at art. Hope you guys enjoyed this, learned a little bit from it, and let me know what you would like to see next. Happy learning. See you next time.